You're a brilliant calculator, Clara, but a deaf woman simply can't be the face of this company. I am Clara Vance, a 34-year-old forensic accountant. I poured $150,000 of my own inheritance to fund his corporate startup from the ground up. That financial sacrifice was instantly erased when I read his lips across our dining table, silently plotting to steal my remaining equity. She won't even hear the lock click when we toss her out. My own sister, Sarah, mouthed back with a smirk. I did not scream. I did not confront them. I simply reached up, switched off my hearing aid, and started pulling his digital tax signatures. By the midnight board meeting, they wouldn't just lose the company. They would face immediate federal asset freezes and IRS indictments in front of 12 stunned board members. This is exactly how their empire fell. If you've ever been betrayed by your own blood, I understand that heavy silence. Tell me your listening location and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Let's rewind to the dinner that changed everything. The corporate office was completely empty at 5 in the morning. I sat alone at Julian's private terminal, the pale blue light of the monitor reflecting off my glasses. For 5 years, I had built his financial startup from a cramped garage operation into a multi-million-dollar corporate entity. I had audited every ledger, structured every tax bracket, and poured $150,000 of my own inheritance into keeping the lights on during the lean years. I was the silent engine in the basement, the reliable workhorse keeping the machine running while Julian smiled for the magazine covers. Now, I was watching the digital security footage from our own dining room, recorded just 12 hours ago. The camera angle was high, capturing the mahogany dining table. Julian and my sister, Sarah, were drinking expensive red wine. I was sitting at the far end of the table, looking down at my plate. I watched my digital ghost sit in complete ignorance, while Julian leaned across the table toward Sarah. He didn't bother covering his mouth. He knew I was deaf, and he assumed the dim lighting and the floral centerpiece made him invisible. But on the high-definition monitor, I could zoom in. I could read his lips with absolute clinical precision. You're a brilliant calculator, Clara, but a deaf woman simply can't be the face of this company. We finalize the restructuring next week. Sarah laughed, her lips curling into a vicious smirk. She won't even hear the lock click when we toss her out. They thought my silence was compliance. They thought my deafness meant I was blind. Watching the footage, I did not gasp. I did not cry for the marriage I thought I had. The panic in my chest solidified into something entirely different. It turned into cold, calculated clarity. I paused the video, closed the media player, and opened the company's master accounting directory. I pulled a high-capacity encrypted USB drive from my purse and plugged it directly into the mainframe. Then, I reached up and switched off my hearing aid. The low, persistent hum of the cooling fans instantly vanished. The world dropped away, leaving me in perfect, absolute silence. This was my domain. Without the distraction of sound or the memory of their voices, I could see the digital architecture of the company with razor-sharp precision. I initiated a mass duplication protocol, pulling 7 years of tax filings, vendor contracts, and private banking logs. The progress bar crept across the screen. I dragged the cursor across Julian's expense reports. $3,000 for a consulting retreat in Aspen that coincided perfectly with Sarah's birthday. $50,000 routed through a shell vendor for marketing research. The financial holes were massive, bleeding the company dry. But where exactly was the bulk of the stolen money going? Suddenly, the screen froze. A bright red warning banner erupted across the dashboard. Security override required, legal storage vault access restricted, medical form authentication required. I stared at the prompt. Why would the corporate legal database require a medical form for access? It was a bizarre, highly specific protocol that made absolutely no financial sense. Julian had been hounding me for weeks to sign my annual health insurance renewal forms. Was this connected? Before I could dig deeper into the prompt, the system flashed a second, much more dangerous warning. Two-factor authentication alert. SMS sent to primary administrator Julian Vance. My blood ran completely cold. The system had just sent a breach alert directly to Julian's phone. He would be waking up in exactly 10 minutes. If he saw that someone was attempting to breach the shadow server from his own terminal, he would lock me out of the entire network before I could secure a single shred of evidence. I had to create a distraction. I yanked the USB drive from the port, shoving it deep into my pocket. I heard the heavy click of the department doors opening behind me. I spun around. Marcus, the overnight security guard, was standing in the doorway, his hand resting on his radio. I deliberately knocked my elbow against the stack of Julian's heavy coffee mugs on the desk. They shattered across the floor in a loud, chaotic crash. I grabbed my phone, quickly submitting an emergency IT ticket under Julian's name. Marcus, thank goodness, I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady, ignoring the broken ceramic at my feet. Julian's terminal is running an unauthorized automated update and it just locked the accounting subnet. I had to force a hard reset, which triggered his security alarms. Could you log this in the incident report so he doesn't panic when he checks his phone? Marcus nodded, pulling out his notepad. Of course. Ma'am, want me to get a mop for that? No, I replied, my fingers wrapping tightly around the warm USB drive in my pocket. I can clean up the mess. By 7 in the morning, I was sitting in my car at the far edge of the corporate parking lot, watching the sunrise through the windshield. I opened my personal laptop, connected to the encrypted USB drive, and began tracing the ghost transactions I had extracted from the server. As a forensic accountant, I knew that money always leaves a scent, no matter how many digital layers an amateur tries to spray over it. Julian was a charismatic salesman, but when it came to double-entry bookkeeping, he was sloppy, arrogant, and predictable. Over the past 24 months, he had systematically funneled small, precise amounts, always under $10,000, to bypass federal reporting thresholds into a domestic LLC called Apex Advisory Solutions. I pulled up the corporate registry records for Apex Advisory Solutions and cross-referenced the tax identification number against the bank logs. The filing address for Apex was a private post office box in downtown Seattle, rented 3 years ago. But when I ran a reverse lookup on the primary bank account holder, the name that surfaced made my hands freeze over the keyboard. Sarah Vance, my little sister. The sister whose college tuition I had paid, whose apartment security deposit I had covered, and who I had brought into the company as a creative director at Julian's insistence. Julian was not just hiding money from the corporate tax auditors. He was systematically draining our marital equity directly into Sarah's personal possession. Every single transfer was logged under freelance design consultation, and every single invoice bore Julian's digital authorization signature. I checked the dates against my personal calendar. A $15,000 transfer was authorized on the exact day I was in the hospital having surgery to adjust my cochlear implant. Another $20,000 wire went out on the morning of our 8th wedding anniversary, while I was waiting for him at a restaurant where he never showed up. They hadn't just robbed the company. They had turned my physical limitations and my trust into their personal cash cow, laughing at my gullibility with every keystroke. I needed to trace where Sarah was moving the money next, but when I attempted to access the secondary clearing portal, the banking system demanded a joint counter authorization key from Sarah's account. I couldn't move forward through the front door without triggering an instant notification to her phone. I sat in the silent cabin of my car, forced to find another way around their defense. Then I remembered the federal quarterly filing cycle. In exactly 2 weeks, the IRS would open its tax portal for corporate quarterly reconciliations. If I could embed their fraudulent transaction logs directly into the official tax package, complete with Julian's embedded digital signatures, it would automatically trigger a federal audit and freeze all linked assets the moment it was transmitted. I bypassed the banking wall by accessing the corporate master tax portal using the administrative master key I had created when we first incorporated the business. I created a silent script that would hold the tampered data in an isolated subfolder, ready to merge with the official submission file on the night of the board meeting. I had mapped the exact trail of their theft, but as I saved the file, a pop-up window appeared on my dashboard, reminding me that my corporate health insurance coverage was scheduled for a mandatory policy review at noon. The trap was setting, but the price was getting heavier. The notification regarding my annual health insurance renewal blinked persistently in the corner of my laptop screen. I sat at my home office desk, the quiet house pressing in around me while the morning sun slowly lit the room. Julian was upstairs, sleeping the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who firmly believed he had already won. I clicked on the notification, expecting to see a standard human resources compliance form or a routine benefits update. Instead, the link bypassed the general employee portal entirely and redirected me to a restricted subfolder in our legal directory labeled Executive Competency Review. I typed in my master administrative override credentials and opened the solitary PDF stored inside. The document was a comprehensive medical assessment from an audiologist in Portland, dated exactly 3 months ago. I stared at the clinic's letterhead, my fingers hovering completely still over the trackpad. I remembered that trip perfectly. Julian had taken 2 days off work, insisting we drive the 200 miles together because he wanted the absolute best specialist for my progressive hearing loss. He had held my hand in the waiting room, rubbing his thumb over my knuckles, telling me we were going to face this challenge as a team. I had looked at him that afternoon and thought I was the luckiest woman in the world, deeply grateful for a husband who cared enough to pause his busy executive life for my well-being. Now, reading the sharp black text on the bright white screen, that memory rotted from the inside out. The document was not a treatment plan or a prescription for a better hearing aid. It was a formal fitness for duty evaluation. The specialist had explicitly concluded that my severe auditory limitations permanently impacted my cognitive processing and my ability to function in a high-stress corporate environment. Attached to this medical summary was a confidential legal memo drafted by our corporate attorney. It highlighted a specific, obscure clause in our company bylaws that allowed the board of directors to forcefully strip an executive of their equity if they were deemed medically incompetent to fulfill their fiduciary duties. They were not just planning to divorce me or quietly vote me out of the boardroom. They were building an airtight legal framework to declare me mentally unfit, a move that would allow them to seize my 70% ownership stake for absolute pennies. I opened the main accounting ledger and ran a search for the audiologist's name, a payment of $12,000, classified falsely under independent legal consultation, had cleared the exact same week as my medical appointment. Julian had literally bought a diagnosis. He had used company funds to pay a corrupt specialist to write a fraudulent report that would rob me of my life's work. I pulled up the dining room security footage from the night before that Portland trip. I watched Julian and Sarah drinking their expensive wine, laughing soundlessly while I sat just feet away. I zoomed in on Sarah's lips. Once the doctor signs off, she's legally compromised. We trigger the medical buyout clause, and she leaves with nothing. Julian nodded, taking a slow sip of his wine. She's too trusting. She thinks I'm doing this because I love her. There was not a single gram of humanity left in my marriage. For 11 years, I was the one who balanced the books, paid the vendors, and built a bulletproof foundation so they could live in luxury. Every touch, every reassuring word Julian had offered over the last year had been a calculated deposition, a carefully staged performance to build a medical case against me. They had weaponized my greatest physical vulnerability, the very thing that made me feel isolated from the world, using it as the knife to cut me out of my own company. I closed the video player. I did not throw my coffee cup at the wall. I did not run upstairs and scream at the man sleeping in my bed. I sat in the perfect, heavy silence of my office and let the cold realization harden my spine into steel. I now held the exact blueprint of their legal strategy, the weapon they were bringing to the Friday night board meeting. I dragged the $12,000 invoice for the fake diagnosis directly into the encrypted IRS audit package I was preparing. They were going to slide this medical disqualification across the table, expecting me to crumble in humiliation. I stared at the blinking cursor, my mind calculating the final counterstrike. How could I make their own medical trap detonate in their hands the moment they tried to spring it? Doi jela fien ban root gon kua kich ban. Gyun guyen tron ven makkam, ksuk. Kat kutwist. Vak hong ki kang, tang kua ban gork. Voijode kuang pint hazen kitu. The Friday night executive board meeting began at exactly 9 o'clock. The corporate boardroom was a massive cage of thick glass and polished steel, perched 40 floors above the Seattle streets. 12 senior board members sat around the long mahogany table. I sat in my usual chair, my silver laptop open, the encrypted tax package running silently in the background. For 5 years, I had led these meetings. Tonight, Julian stood at the head of the table. He pressed a button on his remote, and the projector screen dropped down. It did not display our profit margins. It displayed a highly confidential medical competency review from a Portland audiologist. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we must address a painful family matter," Julian said, his voice dripping with calculated sorrow. "As many of you know, my wife Clara has struggled with progressive hearing loss. Recently, the cognitive strain has become too much. Her condition is severely impacting her ability to process complex data and manage our financial operations." He was publicly stripping away my professional dignity, replacing 11 years of flawless financial leadership with the image of a fragile, incompetent woman. Sarah stood up next to Julian, wearing a designer suit I had paid for. She placed a heavy packet of legal documents in front of each board member. "Clara has given everything to this company," Sarah said softly, exaggerating her lip movements so I could read them. "But right now, we have to protect her from herself." The packets were formal articles of termination and equity forfeiture. Effective immediately, Clara is relieved of her duties as Chief Financial Officer, Julian announced. Her equity shares will be absorbed by the executive trust. Furthermore, her specialized corporate health insurance and medical stipends are terminated, effective at midnight. He was cutting off the insurance that covered my cochlear implants. The cruelty took my breath away, but I kept my breathing slow and even. I needed him to take the final step. To ensure no disruption, Sarah and I will be assuming joint, undisputed financial control of all corporate accounts immediately, Julian stated. He pulled a gold fountain pen from his pocket, signed the primary executive authorization document, and handed the pen to Sarah. She signed her name right beneath his. They thought they were signing a deed of ownership, but I knew they were signing their own federal death warrants. Julian nodded toward the heavy glass doors. Marcus, the security guard, stepped in and stood behind my chair. The humiliation was absolute. "Leave the laptop, Clara," Julian commanded. "Marcus will escort you to your car." The silence in the glass cage was suffocating. I slowly placed my hands on the silver keyboard. "I am not going anywhere, Julian," I said, my voice completely steady. And neither is this laptop, because it is currently holding an active, highly encrypted connection to the Internal Revenue Service. The sympathetic mask on Julian's face slipped. I tapped a single command, bypassing his presentation. A massive, heavily encrypted federal tax portal filled the wall behind him. For the past 24 months, Julian has been systematically draining our corporate equity. I explained to the board. He routed over $800,000 through dummy invoices into a private LLC entirely controlled by Sarah. You thought my hearing loss disconnected me from the truth, Julian, but it only made me pay much closer attention to the math. Julian's face flushed a violent red. She's delusional, Marcus. Remove her right now. The senior board chairman held up a hand, his eyes locked on the flawlessly itemized ledger of federal tax fraud. 10 minutes ago, you both signed the master financial authorization documents, I said, my voice cold as a surgical blade. You legally claimed total responsibility for the company's financial architecture. I have bundled every single fraudulent transfer and the receipt for your fake medical diagnosis into the official quarterly tax submission. I pressed the enter key with a definitive click. The screen flashed bright green. Transmission complete. Federal Fraud Audit Initiated. You just submitted a confessed, cryptographically signed record of federal tax evasion directly to the United States government. I stated. A new red banner appeared. Guarantor Asset Freeze Activated. Julian staggered backward, throwing both hands onto the table just to keep himself standing. Sarah stared at the screen, her jaw dropping as she mashed the buttons on her cell phone, realizing every financial app she owned was already locked out. The board members physically inched away from the two people who were now toxic federal liabilities. Digital chimes shattered the quiet. Julian's phone, Sarah's phone, and Julian's smartwatch vibrated in a synchronized cascade of aggressive financial alerts. Julian snatched his phone, the blood rushing out of his face. He opened his mouth, but his vocal cords seized. His shaking hands dropped the gold fountain pen onto the glass table. His legs gave out, and he slumped heavily into his chair. Sarah's secret trust fund balance was zero. The arrogant smirk was replaced by raw panic. She lunged across the table, desperately trying to grab my sleeve. Now, she was begging. I could read her trembling lips perfectly. Clara, please. Stop it. We can fix this. Please. Julian was shouting now, throwing frantic apologies across the room. I did not want to hear a single word. I lifted my right hand, unclipped my hearing aid, and placed it flat in the dead center of the glass table. The physical world went instantly, completely silent. I watched their mouths moving in soundless, pathetic desperation. I had given them back the exact silence they had weaponized against me. I closed my laptop, slid it into my briefcase, and walked toward the heavy doors. Marcus respectfully lowered his eyes, clearing the path. I walked out of the glass cage, leaving the company I built, walking entirely alone into the quiet night. I drove to the house Julian and I had shared for 7 years. The windows were dark. I walked straight into the kitchen and placed my briefcase on the marble island. My cell phone vibrated violently, displaying 42 missed calls from Julian and Sarah. I simply placed the phone face down on the cold marble, letting the frantic light die against the stone. I filled the kettle with water. I reached up out of habit, but my right ear was bare. I stood in the pitch-black quiet. The estate was entirely mine, legally and financially secured, swept completely clean of their toxic presence. Yet, it was also permanently, unconditionally empty. I poured the hot water into a single mug. I stood alone in the dark, watching the steam rise, breathing in the clean air of my new reality. Deafness didn't disconnect me from the truth. It simply filtered out their lies so I could calculate their ruin in perfect silence.